Hello, everyone, and welcome to our third session in our 10-part government CPE series. Today, we'll be talking about internal controls in a remote environment. I'm Stacy Dreher, Marketing Director for James Moore & Company, and I'll be your host. Our presenters today are two members of our government services team, Brendan McKitrick and Dakota Spencer. In addition to their credentials listed below, both Brendan and Dakota are members of the North Central Chapter of the FGFOA, the AICPA Government Audit Quality Center, and the FICPA State and Local Government Section. So Brendan and Dakota, what do our listeners need to know about internal controls in a remote environment?
Thanks for that introduction, Stacy. Glad you all could make it, and we hope everyone's doing well today. So just want to preface this by saying this is government CPE series, so we're glad you're here to join us, but this is a topic that obviously goes across different industries and organizations. It's not just governments that need internal controls. So basically this is applicable to everyone, and we're glad you're able to join us. Our agenda today, we're going to run through a couple of quick topics. So we're going to start with challenges to remote work and some potential solutions for supporting remote employees. We're going to touch a quick overview on internal controls, just to discuss briefly the 5 categories and a slight deeper dive in them. Then we're going to turn over and talk about controls in the post-pandemic world. And we're going to wrap up with audit considerations in post-pandemic world. And then we're just going to have a quick Q&A if anyone has any questions for us. So starting off with some common challenges of remote work. So we were all forced into this, it feels like 2 months ago. And since then, we've definitely been learning on the fly. I know various organizations, cities, governments, some of our not-for-profits have discussed to me some of the challenges that they've had to go through recently. So we thought we'd touch a couple that that we thought we can help with, and just some of the big key ones for you guys. So the first is just a lack of face-to-face supervision. Not something we always think about, but most of our communication is nonverbal. So it's really hard to be able to gauge how someone's feeling through an email, or if the tone's a little off and you feel like someone could be, upset or not. You really don't have those facial cues to help. And additionally, supervisors actually worry that you're not going to work as hard or efficiently during this time. I will say that research actually shows that across most sectors, employees actually perform better and are more efficient. But employees specifically struggle with a reduction in managerial support.
And I'll just add to that, Dakota, that this is also has somewhat of an impact on internal controls, because as an individual that's maybe part of a key control or part of the segregation of duties, it may become less effective in performing their job for specific duties. For example, if there's an individual that's responsible for performing a bank reconciliation, but possibly they're tied up with other things, or they're performing those late, or possibly not performing them as effectively because they're more interested in watching Netflix or playing Dakota's favorite game, Call of Duty. So again, there could be somewhat of an impact on internal controls, and we'll touch on this a little bit more later.
And this next one kind of goes hand in hand with the lack of face-to-face. There's a lack of access to information. So there's additional time and effort to locate certain items. Normally, you could probably just walk over to a manager's office and ask specifically for X document or X piece of paper, and they could hand it to you. Now they have to figure out if they actually have it saved somewhere. Where is that located on their desktop? Is it in downloads? Is it in documents? Did they save it somewhere else ambiguous? It's mostly my problem some of the times. And then there's the lack of mutual knowledge. So just because you think something is so obvious in an email that you know exactly what you're talking about, you send that email and your staff's looking at it like, I have no clue what they're talking about. Maybe it's this. And we could send some emails back and forth together as we're trying to figure out what's going on. So that definitely can lead to some duplicative time, and it's something that needs to be factored in for your employees.
Yeah, and just to add to that too, I think, as Dakota mentioned, there's some overall inefficiencies there and possibly some frustrations. And again, anytime there's a lack of access to information, there could be a compromise to internal controls. And again, we'll touch on more of that later.
Now, the third one here, I believe this is probably one of the biggest ones. As humans, we have a herd mentality, kind of a wolf pack that we are, but social isolation. So loneliness is the most common complaint among remote employees who do it normally. So let alone forcing forcing most of us to go remote in this current environment. And the large thing I want everyone to take away here is that this loneliness leads to isolationism from your job. And thinking about that, it actually leads employees to feel less involved, like they don't really belong to the organization, and can increase their chances of leaving. And I know on the front end, we spend all this time with HR trying to find the right people to bring in to get these people, and we want to keep all of our good people with us. So this is a large issue for a lot of our government's not-for-profit clients if people start to feel like they're not connected to the organization and leave.
And I will say, like, anecdotally, I mean, we struggled with this as well. I mean, we are, as Dakota mentioned, we're social creatures. So, you know, Skype and cell phones and all of that is great, but it's not the same as, you know, talking to someone face to face or interacting with them in the office.
And a few more challenges, some of you I'm sure are familiar with: distractions or interruptions at home. So childcare responsibilities. Yes, this can include pets. For all of us out there, all the room with no children yet, my cats drive me crazy. But if you've got a young child at home now, you've got to deal with that. They wake up in the morning and they see mom or dad there and they expect you to play with them. They want to show stuff. They want to do stuff with you. They want to show you, look outside, there's a butterfly. They're really trying to get your attention. So it's really hard to kind of create those boundaries and figure out how to work with that and am I neglecting my kid while I'm trying to do my work?
Yeah, and I know for me personally, you know, we have a 2-year-old and we have coverage, so to speak, from about 8 to 5, but there's plenty of people that we work with, either clients or even coworkers, that don't have that coverage. So they're having to juggle childcare and also trying to complete their work. And obviously, the more time taken away from their responsibilities, again, could impact internal controls, segregation of duties, and all of that. And again, we'll look at that in more detail later.
Next up, one I'm sure a lot of people have run into is technology issues. I think it was a week ago, Cox Communications here went out for some parts of Gainesville. And I know I had a couple of people who were working on my team who said they told me they'd get to it Friday, and it was a Tuesday. So not the best thing to not have a reliable connection or not have as fast as speed as you need if it doesn't help and run any of the programs that you have normally in the office. That's definitely something that we have to think about. And then these last two kind of combined together, but bad health habits. So I know personally myself, the fridge is 20 feet away from my office and I can get into it anytime I want. So I can literally snack all the time, and snacking all the time really kind of makes me not want to exercise. And if I don't exercise or do something to get out of the house, that's not good for you. And that can actually, you know, lower some of your mental health. It lowers your efficiency, which then could lead to some stuff falling behind, run into other issues like that.
Yeah, and just to circle back real quick on the technology issues, I know for us specifically as auditors, we're very collaborative in nature. We work with our clients, we work with each other. So whenever we have some sort of technology issue, it, you know, obviously creates some frustration and difficulties on our end. In addition to that, there's certain risks and security concerns that we need to be aware of now that we are more remote. Curtis actually in last week's webinar discussed a variety of risks there, and we'll go through some of those, but, you know, just some best practices as far as if you are remote, you know, having VPN and multi-factor authentication and all of that great stuff. But obviously, the more and more we go remote, the more we're going to have to heavily rely on technology, and the more times we have difficulties with that technology, it just makes our jobs harder. And then just on the last two, bad health habits and overworking, I know for me specifically, I'm sharing a dining room table with my wife, and it's very difficult to somewhat disconnect because it's always right there. We do have some suggestions in the next couple slides, but, you know, it's very easy to, you know, walk away, eat dinner, put our little guy down, and then have to come back because it's right there. And it's, you know, I think one of the recommendations we'll have is just kind of making sure that you don't blur those lines as much.
Yeah, exactly as Brendan said right there on overworking. So it kind of brings back that first bullet point, right? When employers think the employee's not going to be working enough when really they're working too much. And that can lead to a lot of stress and a lot of other issues that they have. And they really don't want that perception of being lazy. Because I mean, to be honest, you know, just over the last couple of weeks, I think to myself, well, I mean, okay, it's like 6 o'clock, but what else am I doing with my day? Well, why can't I just go on and knock this out? You need to try to make sure you have that separation, and you try to hold yourself accountable to, this is when I'm going to work and this is when I'm not, because we're not machines. We can't do it 24/7. So just going through a couple of quick things we can do to help support employees during this time. This is mostly from a management level, but to be honest, employee to employees of the same level, this could be a good thing for everyone to check in on everyone, make sure everything's okay. So the first thing we have here is structured daily check-ins. So what do I mean by structured? Regular and predictable. So at the very start of the month, if you're going to be on an engagement with your team or you're working with a specific group of individuals for a couple of weeks, you say, okay, each day at 10:30, we're gonna have a 15-minute call to discuss any challenges, any issues, or anything's going on. You wanna make sure your employees at this time feel comfortable that they can open up with you to their problems, because you don't want them to just say, oh no, everything's fine. Well, it's not right now, right? We're in the middle of a pandemic and things are still going on all around us. So everyone's still dealing with challenges, whether it be work, emotional, just personal life. And we want to make sure they feel comfortable to be able to tell us these things so we can help them.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I mean, I know this is one that evolves, and Dakota will get to this on the third bullet point, but it's one where you've got to kind of establish what makes the most sense. It may not be daily check-ins, it could be weekly check-ins, it could be every other week. Again, it's one more based on need for what you're going through and what you're having to try and accomplish. It may be close to your fiscal year end, so maybe even more frequent than that. It may be, every hour you're checking in. So again, it's one where having the structure, it makes it easier, not only to complete your job, but also to kind of keep that social interaction up with one another.
And that's a great point. It's not a one size fits all. So the same way with internal controls, which we'll touch on in a little bit as well, there's not just, here's the blanket ones you need to have for your organization, and once you have these, you're good to go. It's not how it works. We're all unique people. We all have unique industries and organizations that we work for, and each one has different challenges and risks associated with that. So then these next two here provide several options for telecommunication. So no one really likes to chat through email. I use email a lot for listing specific things. If I want to make sure I'm sending information to a client and I'm like, here's what I've given you, or here are the things I need, it's really easy, because on a phone call, you get lost in checking in and just seeing how they're doing. And then at the end, you're like, crap, what was I doing this phone call for? So that's why I use email a little more for that. But now with remote employees, we have to understand that we can use video conferencing to get some of these social cues. Maybe we can't be sitting across the table with them, but we can see dining room table to dining room table for Brendan. So to check in and see how people are doing. And then just making sure you establish those rules for communication. So what is the frequency? Maybe for extremely important things, we're going to use instant message. So I'm going to IM you. Maybe if you don't have access to an IM, everyone's got a cell phone nowadays. So you say, hey, if something's really urgent, I'm going to text you. Besides that, I'm going to try to give you a call to check in normally, just to see how things are. So maybe you don't dread that phone call when your boss or your manager is reaching out to pick up the phone. A text message is something that's massively important.
And just to add to the telecommunication, I know Dakota went over several options, and everyone's kind of aware of the Skypes and the Zooms and GoToMeeting and all of that. But one of the valuable tools that we use is screen sharing. So especially when working with other individuals, maybe individuals you're supervising, if you want to be able to show them something that you're working through, either in a specific application or whatever it may be, screen sharing is a very good tool to be able to do that when you're not side by side or in the same office as someone.
Yeah, if you've got that set up, definitely use it. Right now, we use it with a majority of our teams to check in when they have specific questions, because it's just a lot easier to see what's going on when you can see exactly what they're talking about instead of guessing where they're at on the worksheet. So the last couple of things here, opportunities for remote social interaction. So is it corny? Probably. Does it feel forced? Definitely. But we're social creatures, and this is a good thing. So you want to have informal conversations. We actually have established something here, and most of the managers, we call staff, call clients just to check in and see how everything's going. It's not about work. Just want to see, give yourself 10, 15 minutes, talk about life, what's been going on and what's happening. And an easy way to do that is maybe add a couple additional times to a meeting that you already have planned. If you're going to talk with someone for 15 or 20 minutes about a job they're working on, possibly try to add it at the beginning. Personally, I think it's best to separate those completely. So then, if you're going to have a work discussion, you're going to have a work discussion, and then people can know, like, when you're calling to check in for this, it's just something separate completely.
Yeah, I think a lot of people have kind of developed their ways of how they're trying to, do the social interaction, again, being conscious about the social distancing and all that. Some of the things we've done is not work specific, but as employees and friends outside of work, we've had watch parties. So there was a Parks and Rec episode where we watched, all together and kind of were able to interact so we can talk during commercials. And another one that was kind of implemented from a partner in our firm, which I've actually kind of like, is a walk and talk. So basically, if there's a topic or a discussion or some sort of brainstorming that you need to have, but maybe you don't necessarily need to have your computer in front of you. You set up a conference call and you go outside and you walk a couple miles and you're able to brainstorm, get some exercise, get outside. Again, it's just kind of a way to knock out a couple different things and also, hopefully improve those bad health habits.
And the last one here, offer encouragement and support. So it seems obvious, right? Listen and respond, but make sure we're really listening. We need to acknowledge that this is a difficult time. A lot of us already had enough going on. We had plenty on our plate. We still had a full-time job. Everything was going well. And now we've just packed in additional responsibilities on top of all of this, right? So it's okay to feel stress and anxiety and have some concerns going on. We need to make sure we're understanding each other, listening to be able to figure out what these stress and anxieties are. Once we figure that out, double check to make sure we're understanding them correctly, and then see if there's anything you can do to help.
And I think it's important to note too, it's not just employees, it's managers, supervisors, everyone's dealing with, different stresses and anxieties. So encouragement can go all directions.
Yeah, definitely a two-way street. Manager can let an employee know, the employee can let the manager know. Rounds out the team well.
So one of the things I forgot to mention early on in the presentation, I have several jokes in here that are probably pretty bad, but again, we're talking about internal controls, which is already a pretty lively topic, so I figured I'd throw some curveballs at Dakota and Stacy while we're here. So Dakota, why are accountants always so calm, composed, and methodical?
I do not know.
They have strong internal controls. He's laughing on the inside, everyone.
I'm taking a minute to compose myself. Okay. Next, we do have the overview on internal controls, which I know everyone is excited about. Hot, fresh topic that definitely hasn't been around for a long time. So real quick, what is the purpose of internal controls? And I can guarantee one thing, I will not be reading these slides to you as we go forward, but basically in short summation, this is to help employees in their roles achieve the entity's objectives.
And I have somewhat of a loose analogy, and I'm sure people can kind of poke holes through it, but we'll kind of come back to this in a couple slides to hopefully get a better idea or picture for some people. So kind of imagine you're driving your vehicle and the objective is to get safely from the grocery store and back, taking the most efficient route. So basically on that route, you have various risks. You've got other vehicles, pedestrians, traffic lights, which really threaten to slow you down or completely stop you from getting to the grocery store and back. And your car has a number of features that allow you to navigate those dangers. It could be your mirror, your steering wheel, turn signals, and really using those features can increase the likelihood of you getting to the store. So again, I'll circle back to that in a minute.
And here we have everyone's favorite, the COSO cube. Personally, not a big fan, but it does do a really good job of summarizing up the categories and objectives here. So there's obviously operational objectives, reporting, financial and non-financial, and compliance. And we have the 5 components of internal controls. There's the control environment, which you'll almost never hear me say control environment again, because I like to prefer it as the operating environment. We'll discuss why in a little bit. Risk assessment, control activities, information and communication, and monitoring activities. And then on this next slide, it does a really good job of breaking down some of the principles. Once again, I'm sure this is something most of you have seen before, and we will be touching on each of these areas going forward. But here's a great slide for reference for just the key parts of the principles if you want to come back and look at it later. So requirements for effectiveness of our internal controls. So what are we talking about here? So each principle that is being developed has to be present and functioning. So by present and functioning, what are we talking about? We mean, does it exist and is it working?
All right, so this is where I'll kind of circle back to my analogy. So say the car you have is a Tesla, it's a self-driving car. So in theory, there's more safety precautions to avoid accidents. And, I think the thought is that it's probably safer than human drivers. So that would be, again, when Dakota's talking about present, so the control activities being present. I'm not sure how many people have seen, there's a new show on Amazon called Upload, but the premise of it is the main character, or it's in the future, and before people pass on to the other side, they have the option of being uploaded into virtual reality, or they can pass on, I guess, the traditional way. So the main character is in a self-driving vehicle, actually going to somewhere and coming back, and as he's coming back, the car gets in an accident, and then he's forced to make a decision. So basically, in that situation, you have it being present, but the vehicle wasn't functioning. So that's kind of what we're talking about when we're talking about how the principles need to be both present and functioning.
And just a quick touch from the audit side here. So you're thinking, does the auditor look at this? Well, yes. They're required to obtain an understanding of internal controls in your organization when an audit is being performed. However, there is not an actual opinion that is expressed on these internal controls. There's a separate engagement that can be put into for that, but we're not going to go into that at all right now. And just to note, as we touched on earlier, not one size fits all. So these are going to be different for every organization. The government may have different objectives than a not-for-profit, different than a commercial company. And there's definitely not going to be just put these 10 things in place and we go forward.
Yeah, and so this is where I come back to my jokes. So the next joke I've got for you is, what do you call an accountant with an opinion?
Go ahead.
An auditor. They're not going to get any better, people. I'm sorry.
Not an opinion on internal controls. Let's be clear there. Not an opinion on that. And I apologize. So just as we kind of talked about here, the role of external auditors in your organization's internal control. They look at the internal controls, they obtain an understanding of how the design and implementation, but they are not expressing an opinion. And we are not supposed to be a part of the organization's internal control process. Think of us as like a supplemental small check on the back end, but we actually don't give an opinion on it, and we are not supposed to play a key role in this.
And just to kind of piggyback on that is we do, for some of the small organizations and governmental entities we work with, part of the internal control structure, you're supposed to be able to provide or produce a set of financial statements. So our requirement is to audit those statements. The entity's requirement is to provide those. So if there are instances where we're actually assisting in the preparation of those financial statements, we can actually have a comment kind of indicating, hey, we can't be a part of your internal controls, and specifically, we can't help prepare those financial statements. So if you are a smaller organization and you have seen that comment, it's because of this specifically. We can't be part of your internal control process.
And then touch preliminary here on risk assessment. So here we see the components of the fraud triangle: opportunity, rationalization, and pressure or motivation. You've heard it called, I'm sure, before. So these are things that need to be considered when we're assessing risks to meet an organization's objectives. And a little later on, Brendan will actually run through some interesting items on fraud. We have some key statistics from 2018. I believe some just came out from 2020 as well. I don't think there's been much change in those numbers at all. So they haven't been included on here, but we will run through some charts that really show this in some more detail. And we have our first polling question.
Okay, thanks, Dakota. In just a minute, you'll see the polling question pop up. How do you feel about your organization's internal controls? We'll give everybody an opportunity to answer that question. If you're having difficulty answering the polling question, try exiting out of the full screen view on the GoToWebinar platform and see if that helps. And if you're still not able to answer the polling question, just go ahead and submit your answer in the Q&A panel. Okay, looks like most everybody has responded, so I'm going to close this out and share the results. So it looks like 75% of people feel that their organization's internal controls are good. 17% are okay, 8% needs improvement, and 1% is poor.
Or how many of those are honest answers?
Honestly, that's a lot higher than I was thinking.
Yeah.
Which is great. Don't get me wrong. This is government CPE, so I'm hoping all our governments out there are doing a good job of reviewing these. But that's a lot better than I was thinking, which is awesome.
Yeah, and I know Dakota will touch on it a little bit, but there is kind of a risk benefit that has to be weighed by management. So again, that question is somewhat of an opinion. Again, we look at certain facts and circumstances, but we as auditors, we can provide recommendations. Again, we can't make management decisions, but I mean, it's good to see.
All right, continuing on here, the internal control system. So what needs to be here for it to be effective? Basically, this control system is going to provide reasonable assurance for our assets, reliability of information, and compliance with laws and regulations. If you've ever seen an audit opinion, you know reasonable assurance is stamped all over it. So basically, here's a quick definition. It's a concept that acknowledges control systems should be developed and implemented to help management balance this risk. Think of a risk reward type, right? So basically, in bold here at the bottom, the big thing I want you guys to take away is the cost of a control should not exceed the benefit of it. So there are certain things when you're looking at it and doing a risk assessment, which we'll touch on slightly later, as to, is this worth doing for my organization? Well, if we're talking about such a small dollar amount of items and things that almost never happen, or maybe like once a year for you guys, maybe not. Compared to your normal operating procedure that you have happening each day, we definitely need to have some procedures built around that. As Brendan touched on, the balance. So we need to achieve this balance between risk and control. So most of our controls need to be proactive, value-added, cost-effective, and address risk. So the whole purpose of having controls is to make sure they're doing these things. And we need to balance between what's too much risk that we're uncomfortable with and what's just a crazy level of bureaucracy. Think of it that way. So here you see some of the risks and some of the excessive controls. We could have theft against us, right? We could lose assets, we could lose donors or grants. And then what's an excessive control? Maybe there's too much increased bureaucracy. If everything has to be looked at 5 or 6 different ways before it can get through. And then just a couple others to touch on very quickly. Could lead to some poor business decisions if we haven't assessed these, or if there's too many controls, we don't have enough productivity and we're not actually producing anything of value. It's just extra spot checks. And then for our grants out there, there's non-compliance, or I'm sure they're aware with, and then excess controls would be its extreme complexity. So think of it, when you get a grant agreement, you always have multiple things that you have to follow up with, and then the auditor has to come in and do a single audit. Well, then if you try to follow and break down everything specifically in that grant and do everything piece by piece by piece by piece, is that excessive? Is that the risk? Of course, the risk from a compliance standpoint is you're either in compliance or you're not. So that one's more of an all for one and a one for all saying.
And just to kind of, I mean, I think Dakota's saying it, but just reminding, this isn't a static thing. So it's, it's one, and the reason why we're here today is because we're talking about how, things change and how individuals are now remote more so than they ever have. So again, we're looking at this and we're giving kind of some guidelines, but it's one where you've got to remember, hey, things can change, and depending on the facts and circumstances, either in your organization or your industry or what have you, you've got to always kind of continue to kind of look at that balance.
And while we're still at the beginning here, a big part to add is, and you'll see it if you've ever been a part of an audit, that there's a letter stating specifically that management is responsible for ensuring that internal controls are documented, maintained, and adhered to. So design, implementation, and monitoring of these internal controls. But it's big and key to remember that all employees have a hand in this. If you have 5 or 6 employees that don't follow, that could be a massive issue for your internal controls if they're not following your policies and procedures that you put in place. So I said I wouldn't say it again, and I'm going to try not to. So I think of this as the operating environment. So I hate saying control environment when you're talking about controls. It just sounds crazy to me. So this is basically, think of where you operate. So it says consciousness of your organization here, which is a great way to think of it. So Where do your people interact? How do they interact? Who are they interacting with? Is management talking with the employees on a regular basis? What's the kind of structure that these conversations are in? It is basically it from a large factor. And it's intangible, right? You can't go in and show someone, this is my operating environment. There's not a graph that you can put up that easily conveys that to them. So this is something that you need to think of and have put together. This is something that should be reflective in your code of conduct, personally for your organization or for the government. HR policies even are shaped around this as well. So it's definitely something to consider. And this is greatly influenced by the extent to which individuals are held accountable. So it's just the same kind of thing when you were a kid, right? If you were going through something and you knew you weren't going to get punished for it or nothing bad was going to happen to you, what were the odds of you doing this certain action again? Management needs to make sure that there are rules in place here and clearly defined punishments.
Yeah, and you've got a bullet here too, Dakota, talking about setting the setting the tone, and it's really important, especially now in the remote environment. And I think a big part of that is going to be communication. So, I mean, we've already kind of talked about it. We're going to talk about it more, but communication is going to be a big part of setting that tone as far as strategies and controls and making sure those risks and concerns are being addressed.
And then the next key step in our COSO framework, if we'll remember, this is the risk assessment. So there are basically 3 key steps in our risk assessment. We need to determine the goals and objectives of the organization. We need to identify risks after we've determined our goals, which is key. And then we need to perform a risk analysis. And we're going to walk through each of these. So determine our goals and objectives. So obviously they need to be clear, achievable, and these need to matter at each department of our organization. And as the cube, if you'll recall, states, our objectives are classified into 3 separate. So there's the operations of the entity, the financial reporting, and you can think of that as external and internal reporting, and then compliance. So identify risks after determining goals. So once we know what we want to accomplish, we have to ask ourselves, what are the key risks that are going to stop us? And one of the big things that we need to understand here is that we have to ask ourselves these questions. And some of these questions are basic that you have to ask for each organization. So what could go wrong? How can we fail? What must go right for us to succeed? Where are we vulnerable? Do we have specific assets we need to protect? Think that from an IT perspective or a startup. Do we have liquid assets? How could someone steal from us? How could someone stop our operations? So there's internal and external threats there that you need to be asking these questions. And just let me preface that it's not the full list of questions. I'm sure there are hundreds, but those are just a couple that stick out at the very beginning of this process that you need to understand.
And just to add to that too is we're kind of setting a baseline now of what the internal control process looks like. However, these are the same questions you're probably going to need to be asking as things change. Again, as employees are going remote and your risks are changing and your controls are having to be modified. Again, these are similar questions. And as Dakota mentioned, it's not all the questions you need to ask. It's just some examples. And as he mentioned earlier, it's not one size fits all. So it's going to be different for each organization.
And remember, risk is literally anything that could jeopardize the achievement of an objective. So anything that could stop your organization from accomplishing its goals. And this needs to be a comprehensive process. It needs to be at the very beginning, right? This is right after we know this is our operating environment. This is how we're going to do things. Okay, what are our risks associated directly with that? And I said external, internal factors already, but also quantitative and qualitative. So you think quantitative, right? What happens if someone steals property, equipment? What's the cost there? What's the dollar loss if someone comes in and breaks all of our windows? What's our repair costs? But qualitative costs we should look at, government especially, you could lose public trust, lose future grants, gifts, and donations from a not-for-profit or government perspective. Injury to your reputation, right? Bad publicity in the news. That's something that's definitely a cost to the organization. You could have increased regulation, so the state can decide they want to do some additional hoops that you have to jump through, and then that means more time from your employees spent on doing other control-related tasks. You can think where it could be an excess level of bureaucracy instead of actually accomplishing your organization's objectives. And then obviously one of the big impacts is violation of laws. We want to make sure we are in compliance with laws and regulations. So in the last part of our risk assessment here, we need to perform an analysis. So we've identified our risks, we've taken a look, we've gone external, internal. So what do we do now? The easiest thing to think of is kind of from an auditor concept of materiality, right? So what's the likelihood or frequency of the risk occurring? And then what's the potential impact of that? If we're talking about something that is going to occur once every 2 years and the potential impact we think is $300, we probably don't care that much about it from a high risk perspective. And then determine how we need to manage it and decide what actions are needed. And you think of managing these actions, basically that is going to be setting these control activities, which we're going to get into. What controls should be put in place around these specific risks that we can mitigate them to a level where we can achieve reasonable assurance.
And all these conversations are happening throughout the organization. It's not typically not one individual creating a risk assessment. It's, you know, again, multiple individuals across various departments to kind of get a sense as to, well, what are the real risks out there to address?
And as Brendan touched on earlier, and we'll keep stating again, this is ongoing. This isn't something you can schedule periodically. It could be a good thing to help, right? Every 3 months or a year, we're going to look at our risk assessment. Okay, but then a national pandemic comes along and there's probably a new risk that we have to consider. Something massive has changed in our business, and we need to understand how do we need to react to this. And we need to get on the forefront of it instead of just letting those consequences hit us. So talking about how we manage these things, right? How do we manage these risks? What are we going to do around them? So this is when we bring in our control activities. So basically think of it as policies and procedures. And that's simply it, right? You're supposed to have written policies and procedures so your employees know what to do. So think of it as like a guidebook you give employees at the start, right? They've got their handbook and everything, but then when you sit them down to do a specific job, you may have a 10-page thing of, this is how you enter this in the system. This is how this goes through the approval process. This is how we walk through this. This is how you double check that. So you're basically telling your employees what to do to ensure your organization's objectives are met. And controls can be 2 types. There's preventative controls and detective. So which the easiest way to think of it is one's being proactive and one's retroactive. So preventative, right, you're trying to do that right at the very stop to prevent the event from happening. Detective is we want to see if it actually happened. So one is before and one is after. It's the easiest way to think of it.
Yeah, and I'll circle back to kind of the top part of the PowerPoint. There's a phrase in there, timely manner as well. What's interesting is sometimes we'll find controls that have been implemented because of, you know, a specific situation where an organization got burned on doing something. And one of the easy examples is multiple reviews or approvals. So for whatever reason, they've implemented maybe 2 or 3 additional checks and reviews and sign-offs. And then we'll come in and typically we'll review those controls and then we'll ask the why. You know, why are you doing it this way? And sometimes there's not a great answer, where you may have 1 or 2 reviews that are all, you know, all you really need, again, to manage or reduce those risks, but now you're doing 3, 4, or 5. So again, you've got to kind of look at it, and that's why we're saying it's an iterative process where, you know, even though you've had a control and you've done it for 10 years, well, does it really make sense for your current risk environment, you know, and your current control structure to continue to do it that way? So, I mean, we look at it like we want to make sure we're managing those risks and we're doing the right things to implement the right controls, but we don't want to have controls for control's sake. You know, we want to make sure the organization's able to kind of run efficiently.
And that's a great point, specifically on the timely manner part as well. I've had clients who do bank reconciliations and they are reviewed 3 months after they're done. So, I mean, it works out, the reconciliation's fine, but if it's still 3 months later and you think about that from a risk perspective, that's 3 additional months where something could be happening, right? So we need to really focus on that. And so there's lots of different types of control activities that we could go into here. I know Brendan's going to go into some more a little later specifically. So I'm just going to kind of mention a few here and there. There's authorization, reconciliations, which we've discussed about, performance reviews. So That's actually can be, you think of internally employee to employee level, but for governments especially, what's our budget to actual look like? What's our prior year look like? Have we looked at various benchmarks, compared us to other governments to see where we are? Security of assets is actually preventive and detective. Control system or security system that you've got set up to guard some of your assets. Segregation of duties, Brendan is going to touch on a little more detail later, so I'll leave for that. And there's even controls over information systems.
And just to add to that too, I mean, some of the authorizations and approvals that we might see may be purchase approval limits. So again, where they're making sure that certain individuals have the capability of purchasing, but only up to a certain limit. On the IT side, it could be how you set up users in the application. Really, we want to make sure that those, the access that they have is really commensurate with their job responsibility, and it's nothing more, nothing less. As far as security of assets, physical controls is a big one there. So, how are people getting access to the building? Is it with a key card? How are they getting access to the server room? Can they, potentially impact the IT controls? And I know Curtis hit on it too. Now that you have, or Curtis in his presentation last week kind of mentioned it, was now that you're working remote, are you locking your front door? Are people able to get to your computer from your house? And then on the reconciliation, I think an easy one is the bank reconciliation, because everyone's kind of familiar with that. But really, a reconciliation is agreeing 2 or more documents together. That's a good way to check that everything is kind of tying down. And even on the IT side, we look at, if you've got 2 systems, say you have a billing software and a general ledger, but they're not really talking, so to speak, it's not an automatic transfer. It could be a simple, I say simple, but it could be a journal entry into the general ledger, but how are you making sure that that information is coming over accurately and completely? Is there some sort of reconciliation? And that's something we would look at, on the audit side to make sure, okay, how do you know everything coming from the billing software is actually getting pulled in? Are you doing some sort of check? Like, as management, how do you get comfortable with that? So again, there's a lot of examples out there, but those are just a few to kind of think about.
And now we have our second polling question.
All right, thanks, Dakota. In just a minute, we'll see the second polling question. What percentage of internal controls in your organization were impacted by the pandemic? So we'll give everybody a minute to respond. Again, if you're not able to respond to the poll, just submit your answer in the Q&A panel. Okay, it looks like answers are still coming in, so we'll let this run for a few more seconds here. All right, it looks like we have most people. I'm going to close this and share the results. So it looks like 58% of people said 0 to 25% were impacted by the pandemic. 31% of people said 25 to 50%. 10% said 50 to 75, and 2% 75 to 100%.
And honestly, that's to be expected. This is a massive change that no one prepared for. Anyone who was alive for the Spanish flu excluded, of course, but no one is used to having this happen, especially in an age of technology where we're at. So we have all these new things, and we've had to implement all these so quickly. So obviously some different things have changed, and in a little bit we are actually going to talk about what your auditor may be asking you when he comes out to figure out what these things changed and how it's going to impact their testing, and some questions that you actually probably need to be prepared to answer. So our fourth step here, information and communication. So basically this is talking in all aspect. I mean, this is a big part of the cube that I think you could show even a pyramid. And I think there are charts out there with the other 4 parts, and just information and communication going all the way up, because you have to talk, you have to be able to pass timely information and information effectively and efficiently throughout your organization to those who need it most. And you got to do it at such a time where it's reliable and relevant, and it goes from the timeliness. And then how accurate is it? Is this from internal or external sources? If it's reports from last week and everything's changed because of a pandemic and we need new reports this week, those are things that you have to consider, and how quickly is that being communicated to everyone?
And that's really up, down, and across the organization. And I kind of think of it as kind of the glue. Dakota has this, he kind of mentioned it's across all the 4 others, but really you've got to have that. I mean, if you don't have information and communication, it's not going to work.
Especially at a time right now. Imagine if you couldn't communicate with your employees when they're remote. That'd be a rough sentence. So then the last one we have here to kind of wrap up our overview is monitoring. So note it's the assessment of internal control performance over time. And then it's accomplished by ongoing activities and different separate evaluations that are performed. So the key part is we want you guys to understand this is over time, because one thing is working today doesn't mean it's working tomorrow. If someone else comes in and is doing something a separate way than someone else that you have doing the exact same task, for instance, a part-time staff, and they're each helping to fill a full-time role, and they're doing it 2 separate ways, then one could not be doing it and following your control policies. So that's why you need to have these ongoing monitoring activities to really see, okay, yes, I know my controls are present, right? I've gone through, we've talked about it at the top, we've talked with everybody in our organization, we got the environment figured out, we've done our assessment of risks, we've set up these policies and procedures for our control activities that we know need to be accomplished. We're still talking about it, we're communicating up and down, but now, are they happening? So this is basically your functioning aspect of are the controls present and functioning. So there's different ways to accomplish this. You can do a self-assessment. You can have someone else come in from outside your organization to a peer review. And even large organizations obviously do internal audits and have their own internal audit department where employees are literally, their job is just to test the controls of the organization. So while it is a process, its effectiveness is an assessment over time. And yeah, I'm hammering that in because this is something that needs to be checked regularly. Ongoing activities help with a lot of problems and help us catch a lot of things on the front end. We'll get to the kind of the spot where Brendan talks about fraud and some things like that, but actually these ongoing activities and monitoring procedures that you guys put in place can help start a lot of bad things, can help stop a lot of bad things before they begin, and they can even especially help in the detective side of things when you can see that there may be something that shouldn't be going on.
And I think Dakota's hammering this because this one is often overlooked. It's one where I think people kind of assume that everything's working appropriately, but if you're not actually monitoring or checking it, how do you really know? I think there's kind of 2 areas I kind of look at for monitoring controls. You have kind of the periodic or the continuous. Continuous to me is more of that automated. Do you have some sort of system or computer application that's actually checking it, almost real time? Periodic is more of kind of the manual process. Again, Dakota mentioned some examples, but say you have 10,000 AP disbursements and you're doing a manual review. Well, that could be I want to sample 500 of those disbursements and test it. Now, with that being said, we've talked about how things need to be timely. So is that going to be done in a timely fashion, or is it going to be done several weeks from now? And if that happens, how effective is that really? And then on the ongoing side, from a system perspective, are there certain system checks that you can implement? I know from the IT perspective, there's certain what we would consider, and we've mentioned this before, high risk type activities, and that may be, your organization may say, hey, we want to make sure that there's not, inappropriate access within the application. So you may have an automated log come out identifying any failed login attempts. Or it could be, hey, we want to make sure that anyone who has a pay rate change within the payroll application, there's some sort of notification going to the appropriate individuals and not just going to the individual who can make that change. So again, that would be something where you've got to kind of think about, well, what are the risks? What are the controls to kind of mitigate those risks?
And a key part of this is, remember, we're not talking about looking at everything. Remember, the whole part at the very beginning of this was reasonable assurance and balancing that risk between cost and benefit. Have we reduced our risk enough that we can rely on these things? Because if we wanted absolute assurance and we wanted to know, we'd have to look at every single thing in the organization. If you have employees dedicated to looking at all of that, I mean, it's almost impossible to be able to look at everything from everything that a government does on a daily basis in each transaction. Not just a government, talking not-for-profit, construction entity, healthcare, hospital. It's almost an impossible task. So make sure we're looking at high-risk areas. And how do we know what the high-risk areas are? We performed our risk assessment.
All right, so the next area we're going to speak on is the internal controls in a post-pandemic world. But before that, I've got another question for Dakota. You ready, Dakota?
I'm always ready.
What do you call a trial balance that doesn't balance?
Crap.
Close. A late night.
That's true.
So what do we do now? I mean, we've kind of talked about this, you know, how this risk assessment process isn't one that you just do once and set aside. Really, it's time for, you know, another risk assessment. So, you know, the control environment itself is changing. You've got, you know, employees going remote. You've got new risks that you didn't have before. You know, it's really probably can be difficult to monitor and analyze the financial information, review and approve transactions, keeping even your IT systems up to date. So Dakota mentioned this earlier, but, you know, really planning a meeting with your team, going through your internal control processes, asking questions like, what are your weak spots? What could go wrong? What if a team member is unable to work for a certain amount of time, or, you know, maybe they're out for parts of the day? Even consider including, you know, those charged with governance. So maybe your commission, your council, your board, whoever that might be, so they're aware of what those changes and impacts could be as well. Also making sure now having a communication with IT, that is, you know, especially now is as important as ever. You know, I mentioned Curtis's presentation last week, but there's a, you know, a variety of new risks involved with having a remote workforce. And if you're not thinking about, you know, how employees are now accessing your network and what risks are involved with that, and making sure that there's sufficient controls, you know, like VPN and multi-factor authentication, and even making sure that the computers that are being utilized by employees are the ones that are provided by the company, because, you know, letting other personal computers, you know, increases risks as well. So again, those are the kind of communications you need to have with your IT department, whether it be an employee or even if you've got an outsourced IT group. Continuing to cultivate really a culture with controls. And, you know, we talked about the regularly scheduled phone calls or video chats, but communication is really key in the internal control environment. Really, these additional conversations help with monitoring your internal controls, and also helps with employee morale. Seeking opportunities for controls to evolve rather than get circumvented. So, you know, you're not discarding a control because now you're completely remote, but maybe you're trying to leverage some of the technology to enhance that control. Or, you know, if there's virtual review and approval processes within your software, you know, can you do an electronic signature versus maybe a hard signature? Or can you do maybe an email approval versus maybe prior to that, you were just doing some sort of, you know, again, a physical signature. So thinking of those types of situations where maybe you don't discard the control, you just kind of see how you can modify it. And then segregation of duties is key. We'll talk about this more in a little bit, but, you know, in smaller and less complex organizations, you know, you already have it difficult. When you're going remote, I mean, it's probably even harder. And using technology and communication to hopefully leverage some of those segregation of duties, whether it's within the application or creating some sort of backup for key internal control individuals. You know, and there's plenty of tools out there like Microsoft Teams and, you know, GoToMeeting, even billing software that can help with hopefully implementing multiple levels of review, and again, trying to segregate those duties to make sure that, you know, you don't have any of those additional risks.
And yeah, just to add everything Brendan touched right here, you'll notice the theme through all 5 of these things. How are you going to know any of these things are happening? We have to communicate. We're talking about the risk assessment. We're talking to our IT about risks. We're talking about our team about what the impact's going to be. Someone who normally does the control process is telling you they're going to be out, so now you know a step to the side of this control or figure out how to implement it in this new world. So once again, it's all about communication, your team timely.
So this should be familiar. We're doing a risk assessment again. So again, nothing's changed here. You're determining your goals and objectives. You're trying to identify those risks, performing risk analysis. And again, I'm not going to go through this in detail because Dakota already touched on this, but this is kind of the first step in that risk assessment. Again, now you're identifying those risks. And then we thought we would brainstorm some examples. Again, this isn't going to be everything. And I think it's one of those where you just have to start to have that conversation as a group, maybe on the management level, even with your employees. But some examples that we've seen are, you know, what about customer collections? So what's that look like? You know, you've got companies and employees, you know, even on a personal level that are possibly having difficulty making payroll. You know, they're having difficulty on their own end with cash collections. So, you know, from your organization, either, you know, government on the utility billing, or even, you know, if you're a for-profit, is there a risk there with regards to how collections are going to look like?
And then specifically, actually on the government side, I actually had a conversation today regarding most governments have, you know, delayed shutting off utilities, obviously, for people during this time. And it's something that I know a lot of counties and cities have done, especially lately. So now, as we're getting towards the end, right, 6/30 was kind of the end of the big CARES Act unemployment benefits and kind of some of those items. Now we have to say, so how are we going to collect that money? It's a risk that we have to look at, right? Are we just going to have a higher bad debt and an allowance account for this year to offset that? Is everyone ever going to catch up? How do you do it? That's just something you need to be talking about.
Yeah, another example too is, again, for some smaller organizations, they may try and modify how and where they get paid. So if you were sending a check to a company's address and now those employees are no longer working there, and they ask you to write a check to someone's home address, I mean, that to me is a red flag and probably high risk. So then you've got to kind of consider, and we'll talk about this more in kind of the control side of things, but is that a risk you're willing to take? Probably not. So are there other controls or means to pay those vendors, and, you know, whether it be electronic payment or whatever it may be, but again, that may be a new risk that you're having to try and address.
And all of these are items that we understand it's still kind of recent change, right? 2 months, still recent, given all of all the life we have to live. So we need to understand that there are new risks that are popping up every day. Just because we've identified them from 2 months ago, now today there could be something else that has popped up that we've just figured out. Maybe we had some weakness in our system that we didn't know before due to so many people going remote, and now this is something that we need to address. And if we have to address that, then we get into the whole process, which I think Brendan's going to walk us through here shortly, of we have to get a new control activity. How are we going to mitigate this risk? Is it important enough to mitigate? What's the cost benefit of it? Do we need to do anything about it?
Mm-hmm. Just a couple others, cybersecurity. So again, that's more of, you know, how are we protecting our organization from cyber criminals? You know, hopefully there's already some sort of training that's happening on your organization side, but there are probably new risks there. You know, people are remote, and a lot of the times, you know, and Curtis mentioned it last week, what these criminals will do is they'll create a sense of urgency. So you may have a new situation where an individual with some, you know, high responsibility with, you know, possibly paying out certain, you know, dollars may get an email now that they're remote, making an email from a cyber criminal to say, hey, this needs to get paid now. So again, it's just kind of reiterating, hey, cyber criminals are still out there. They may change how they do things, but it may be a new type of risk that we haven't seen before. And then along the same lines is network security. And again, Curtis talked about this, but you know, how employees are accessing the network within the organization. You know, are they able to get onto VPN to create kind of a hardened line to the servers or whatever they're trying to access? Is there multi-factor involved? You know, what kind of new risks are people trying to log in with their personal computers? You know, what risk does that pose to the organization? So again, these are only a couple. I'm sure there's a lot of others out there, but it's just some examples of maybe new risks that you need to consider as you're kind of moving forward through your risk assessment. Again, this is a kind of a recap of what Dakota already mentioned, but now you've identified those risks, you're doing a risk analysis and kind of going through to determine, okay, what are the ones we really need to address? So fraud considerations, again, Dakota touched on this, but the fraud triangle, again, those are your incentives, pressures, and opportunities. You know, and again, those may change now that we're in a remote environment. So what are some of those opportunities? So you talk about internal controls, you know, possibly those being modified or not in place, maybe not being enforced or monitored, maybe not being effective, maybe a lack of segregation of duties. You know, again, you may have someone that's in that segregation of duties kind of implementation and they're not able to do their function. Maybe too much trust, so lack of supervisory review. So if the supervisor is not able to review employees' work, it may be poor tone at the top. You know, we talked about communication being key. So if that communication's been disrupted, what's that look like now? Rationalization, again, that's one where, you know, an employee may say, hey, I don't think I'm getting paid enough. You know, I'm taking the money now, but I'm probably gonna, you know, I'll pay it back later when, you know, I've kind of made up the funds. And then pressures and motivation. So really those are those, you know, what we're going through now is, you know, you may have a spouse, there may be a spouse or a family member who, you know, has lost their job, or, you know, you've got some sort of financial pressure there to really motivate those individuals. And then we've got some examples here on this slide and the next slide of, you know, again, this isn't going to be everything you see, but just some that you may see, you know, possibly an overstatement of revenue. So again, as decreased customer spending occurs, you may be, you know, organizations may try and overstate those revenues. Dakota mentioned this, but understatement of allowance on AR. So if there is a risk that collections may not be as good as they have before, and you may not, you know, there may not be an adjustment to that allowance. So again, this is just an example of what could be capitalization of expenditures. That's always a risk, but maybe more so now, depending on kind of what the goal is of the fraudster, so to speak. Disclosure fraud. So, you know, one of the big ones we're working through with clients is, how are you disclosing the impact of COVID? You know, what's it look like? Is there something that needs to be communicated? So if you don't include it in your financial statements, are you really misleading the user? So again, that would be an example of disclosure fraud. Business interruption insurance claims. So again, you may want to make it look really bad, so you're getting some sort of insurance proceeds. A couple more examples. Dakota mentioned this. You know, reconciliations not being performed timely. There could be an urgency to complete a task, so you may want to just kind of, rather than jump through all the hoops, just kind of work through and, you know, pay out a benefit payment. Payroll timesheets not being reviewed and approved timely, or not being reviewed at all. Inventory management, again, it's, you know, people aren't on site anymore, so maybe they're not looking over inventory as they have in the past. So Stacy mentioned we need to speed up a little bit, so I'm going to go through a couple of these slides probably a little bit quicker than I would have. The next several are some graphs from the associations of certified fraud examiners. They release an annual report called the Report of the Nations. Really interesting, a lot of graphics in there. This is actually data from 2018, but the 2020 is available. The numbers really haven't changed much. Some of the takeaways that I thought were kind of interesting, this slide specifically, is where is the fraud actually being detected? And two, I want to point out here, the number one being tips at 40%. And then the other one that's kind of interesting to me is the external audit at 4%. Again, Dakota mentioned, you know, as external audit, we're not a part of the internal control process. I mean, there are possibilities for us to detect that. We do look at certain things, but again, just kind of want to highlight those two things. We'll circle back to that in a minute.
And note that the tip part here, in a quick control process they can put in, or a control activity put in place, is an employee hotline, right? So if tips are catching 40% of fraud overall, or how they're detecting it initially, it's a really easy thing to put in real quick to have employees call a number and help that. A lot more helpful than an external audit on that front.
The next one is just types of organizations victimized by fraud and kind of the median amounts of loss. Again, the numbers haven't changed significantly. Specific to government, I thought it was interesting. They did have a graphic for 2020 talking about the breakout, and they indicated that of the total amount of fraud in government, 45% was on a federal level at about 200,000, 21% on a state level at about 91,000, and then on the local level, which is your, local municipalities, 32% at about 75,000. So this slide is actually what was interesting when you compare to the first slide, because you'll actually see, as far as what anti-fraud controls are in place, and just for comparison purposes, in 2020, external audit's actually number one at 83%. Now, if you remember the first slide, it catches about 4%. So as far as effectiveness, it's not really doing that great of a job. And then if you look a little further down, you can see the hotline, which is what Dakota mentioned at about, was that 50 some odd percent, which is actually at 64%. And they did indicate that over the last 10 years, that has increased about 13%, which is a good sign. But again, it's an interesting kind of trend where you see a lot of what's being identified for fraud is in these tips, which would become, from hotline. There's other avenues that you could get it as well, but it's one where, I think that's one where you can implement it and potentially find some fraudulent activity.
Yeah, and it's just a key point to point out here that the auditor's job is to provide reasonable assurance on the financial statements, not to specifically search for fraud. So some things we can't catch. We're not all perfect, but also if it's well hidden, there's collaboration going on, there's some things we're not going to find. So if the most anti-fraud control is external audit, that's something that's not catching a lot of fraud. Maybe we should look into things that are really effective and efficient instead of relying on the external auditor there. So just something to consider for governments, not-for-profits, and other organizations.
Yeah, this is just a breakout of primary internal control weaknesses. Actually, not really a surprise, and not one I would see a lot of change in our current environment. But again, another nice visual there. This talks about kind of the red flags for fraud perpetrators. I think the only thing I'd like to kind of say here is it's probably going to be harder to see those in a remote environment. Whereas if someone's coming in every day, they drive in with their new Lamborghini, that's probably something you would identify pretty quickly. Now it's not as easy to find. All right, so you can, Dakota, keep going. So a lot of these we've touched on. So yeah, this one, again, the objective is we're really trying to mitigate those identified risks. So really when we're considering modifying controls, kind of some of the big takeaways here, you want to clearly define and document the adjusted processes and controls, making sure that you're identifying any changes to those roles and responsibilities for segregation of duties, ensuring proper management approval is received, communication of those modified changes in processes and controls for all parties. Again, you want to communicate across the organization, and maintaining accurate documentation for evidence of control performance, even though it may be different from evidence maintained in the past. So again, we're auditors, we love documentation. So making sure you save that, even if it has changed.
And I will touch on this slightly because clearly defined documented processes and controls is one of the first things the auditors ask you for at the start of each audit. So we want your updated control process procedures and memos. So we want to clearly say, okay, what are the control activities you have put in place? So then we can actually grab a couple of those controls and test the monitoring process, right? So we're actually going to monitor those, if you think of it that way, to see, okay, were these controls performed at some point during the year? And then normally that doesn't involve a large population, taking like one or two just to see if your process is how you say it is, unless we're doing a test of controls. That's a separate thing.
So a couple examples. One, I mentioned signatures. So whereas maybe you were doing some hard signatures, now consider doing electronic. If there's internal approvals, consider possibly doing emails if that's sufficient. Again, depending on what you're trying to do approvals on. Also considering control owner availability. So we talk about segregation of duties, but if there's someone who's kind of a key aspect of your segregation of duties and they're not available to do their job, is there a backup? Is there someone else that can do that task or that process? Making sure you're identifying what those changes look like and you're able to kind of continue segregating the duties, sufficiently. The next 3 slides are just some examples for small organizations to segregate duties. Again, we pulled this from the CPA, but kind of the big takeaway here is what we call ARC. So really you want to make sure the separation of authorization, custody, and record keeping, really who receives and maintains the asset, who has authorization to approve the transaction, and who's recording on the GL. And again, the next 3 slides are just some examples how you would segregate it for small organizations.
And to clarify, all those are available on the AICPA websites for you guys to grab those, and they are in this PowerPoint for you. So Brendan kind of touched on this a little earlier, but just some IT general controls. I think he's actually talked about all 3 of these recently when he was kind of referring to what Curtis did. Highly suggest if you need any help on IT or anything like that, reaching back out to the webinar from last week, taking a look at that, because Curtis went through some great stuff and definitely had some interesting stories.
Okay.
Yes. Squeeze in the last polling question.
Right, our last polling question of the day, right before the session ends. You'll see that on your screen. What three elements of the fraud triangle consist of incentives, pressure, and what? Good time, money, or opportunity? So we're going to give everybody a few more seconds to respond. And again, submit that in the Q&A panel if you're not able to respond to the poll. Okay, it looks like most of you have responded, so let's share the results. 1% good time, 5% answered money, and 94% answered opportunities.
So the correct answer was actually all of the above, which was not a selection, but yeah, very good. So then real quick, going to touch on this as fast as I can. So what's going to happen from the audit perspective? So the answer is more procedures, which I know you all love to hear. So any controls that change during this 3 to 4 month window kind of still ongoing. Well, if an auditor does a test of controls and they do these control process memos, they'll probably want an additional process memo to see what changed and what specific things had to be adjusted during this time. And then if they're going to do that test of controls, it could actually lead to them selecting even more additional items for you to provide support for. So everyone loves more work. I do. It's fantastic. So that's just one of the things you need to take into consideration. The auditors will be considering if there's an impact on risk assessment. So if there's a specific part or phase of the audit where you're looking at, like, really they're digging down hard on this, why are they doing that? We could see a potential additional risk due to the changes in the environment that has happened, which may require us to do a little more testing. We may look at things through a finer scope. Talked about the walkthroughs and tested controls, more substantive testing. So yeah, we may beat up the balances a little harder than normal. So we apologize for that. We will probably apologize for that during the audit as well. We're definitely going to be working with secure web portals. Personally, we use ShareFile to send everything encrypted and make sure all of your information is safe. That will continue to be used. And Brendan also mentioned the share screen aspect for being able to easily show you what we're looking at, because sometimes we have questions when we go back and forth. And obviously communication is going to be key. I can't sit across the table and talk to you. So we're going to be giving you phone calls. We're going to be Skyping you IM and things like that. That's a real quick summary up. And I think we made it. Apologize for rushing through the end there, and I'll let Stacy kind of take it away here at the end.
Nice job, you guys. Thanks, Brendan and Dakota, for walking us through that. This is just a quick plug for our webinar next week. If you haven't already registered, visit the link on the slide and register for that, and check out the other 7 sessions in our 10-part series. So we hope the information was valuable today. For those of you who submitted a question, we'll follow up with you shortly. So thanks for joining us and have a great day.